My dear friends, this week, in our canter through some of the main themes of Romans, we are going to be talking about the pleasures of the flesh, our carnal desires. What does Paul mean when he talks about this? A good way to think about it is to think about what we have in common with animals and what is different between ourselves and animals. Consider a wild boar in our forest. That boar will have needs. They'll need to eat, they'll need to exercise, they will need to sleep, they will need affection, they will need to reproduce. All those things are shared with us. They are our biological drives. And that's basically what Paul is talking about when he's talking about our sinful desires, which is how the NLT, the translation I'm using, translates Paul's word flesh. If the boar acts to fulfill their needs, we don't normally think that they're being sinful. So why is Paul concerned about this with us? The difference is that human beings have what is classically called a rational soul. The wild boar in the forest don't have much discretion over whether to act upon their biological impulses or not. We do. In fact, our human society is built upon the regulation of our biological needs. If we look at how those needs I mentioned above are handled in human society, we can see all sorts of ways in which they're bound in with cultural regulations. We tend to eat in a certain way, with certain rituals. We eliminate that food waste in a certain way, with certain rituals. We act with other human beings in certain ways, with certain rituals. We, until very recently, reproduce in a certain way, again bound up with certain rituals. What all these rituals do is form and condition our biological impulses in a way that means human society can function. All these rituals are part of what Paul is talking about when he mentions the law, and the law is good. It's a means of grace and a gift from God. Why then might Paul, in our passage today, talk about the law of sin and death? Simply put, keeping to the rules and rituals of human society does not mean that we get saved. There are two linked problems. The first is that none of us actually managed to keep all the rules successfully. That was the burden of last week's cry from Paul, "Wretched man that I am!" He who does the things that he doesn't want to do. The second is that even if we did keep the rules successfully, it wouldn't be enough to enable us to become the sort of people that God has called us to be. We do not get to heaven by keeping the rules, no matter how wonderful and true those rules might be. Keeping rules is not the end point of the path of holiness. Now here I need to use the word integrity. Integrity is the result of integration, and in this context, integration means binding together all the different parts of ourselves into a coherent and meaningful whole. That is integrity, self-mastery. We all have bodily appetites, and we more or less conform to our society's standard ways of managing those appetites. Yet we have also been made in the image of God, and there is a calling, a vocation, that each of us have to express that image within our world. That vocation can be overwhelmed by a biological appetite. We're all familiar when that happens in the case of an addiction, which takes life away in more or less direct forms. That is sinful desire, a desire within us that will destroy our integrity if we give in to it, a temptation. Our path to integrity can also be overwhelmed by social conformity, when a person is too terrified of social disapproval to be themselves. Those are not carnal desires so much as worldly desires, desires for social esteem. The path of holiness is the path of integrating all the different needs we have, the biological needs, the social needs, into something which also enables us to express our truest nature, to show forth the image of God which is in each and every one of us. There are forces ranged against that process, of course. As the hymn has it, The world, the flesh, and Satan dwell around the path I tread. The forces of the enemy are all about disintegration, about tempting us into making choices that lead away from our own integrity, that destroy us, that mean that we lose our souls. It's when we succumb to a carnal desire, as when adultery destroys a marriage, or overindulgence in food leads to an early grave. Those are the sinful desires of the flesh. It can also happen when we act in ways that we don't believe in, because we're afraid, either because we want a quiet life, or because there are men with guns who will shoot us if we don't comply. Those choices are the broad and easy path, as opposed to the narrow way of salvation. Our Christian disciplines, prayer most of all, are the ways in which to support the process of integration and to provide us with the means to resist the forces of disintegration. This is our spiritual struggle, and the Holy Spirit is sent to help us in that. If we live according to the Spirit, then we enter into the life of joy and peace, which is God's intention for us. When we do this, we enter into our inheritance as children of God. And that's what I'll talk about next week. Until we meet again. Amen.